Alright, what's up? What's good? It is time to talk about anime of last season. If you can remember that far back, this is a pretty late video, but better late than never and all that. I'm happy to finally have finished watching all these shows, put together all the slides, and given myself an opportunity to talk about them at length, because we got some good ass shows to discuss. Starting with the obligatory breakdown of stuff that I didn't watch. The 100 Girlfriends Who Really, 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 Really Love You is one that actually got quite a lot of praise. And it got praise in a way that actually made it sound very appealing to me, that it's just like a really goofy, really over-the-top, irreverent, self-parodious, kind of gag rom-com series in the style of stuff that was more popular like in the 90s. And all of that like really lines up with my tastes. The premise I found kind of distasteful though, and I thought if they ever really try to make this like sincere, if they ever try to kind of go for the heartstrings instead of just the cheap, silly laughs, I could see that actually being like pretty offensive. As someone who was in a polyamorous relationship for over a year and has spent a lot of time reading about polyamory and learning the history of it and talking to other people who are in polyamorous relationships and stuff, like, I think there's a way to do this that's just, like, really stupid. And I thought there was a decent chance that this series was going to fail to really kind of grasp it conceptually if they ever went for it seriously. So, I don't know, I thought it would be interesting to watch and then analyze in those contexts with that sort of lens, but I just didn't get a chance. Who knows if I will, maybe I'll read the manga. Shy, I heard quite a few good things about. I never really learned exactly like what it was, but the images and stuff I saw from it looked pretty interesting. Another one where, if I had infinite time, I'm sure I would definitely get something out of, but I just didn't get the chance. Overtake had an interesting premise to me. It was all about F1 racing. I love a series that promises to be kind of educational and get into the technical details of a subject where I don't really know that much about it, and F1 I know basically nothing. So I thought that would be pretty cool, but again, time constraints just didn't happen. Stardust Telepath is a just very wholesome looking, calming, soothing slice of life with some comedy elements, some supernatural elements. I think it runs in Kirara comics, or at least it might as well, which is all stuff, historically I've loved. I find these days I'm not like aching and craving new slice of life anime, or even like watching that much slice of life in general. I think it's just because my life is in a place these days where I don't need that sort of soothing as much, which is like really great to be able to say. So I don't know, it's not like I've moved on from the genre as a whole, but it's just like not as high on my priorities, so I didn't end up watching this. Under Ninja, I heard a lot of praise for as well. Again, I probably will just end up reading the manga because the praise seemed to mostly be around the premise and setting and stuff, and the concept of the school full of undercover ninjas does sound, pretty wacky, pretty fun. This was another kind of slice of life series. We watched the first episode of this in our anime club, and I thought it was quite pleasant. It got quite a lot of notoriety because the Crunchyroll release of the first episode had like very blatantly machine translated subtitles that were just like god awful and straight up incorrect in a lot of spots. So it attracted quite a bit of controversy around that, and that made me kind of take notice of it, but I didn't end up watching it. This was a very yaoi-coded slice of life series that I thought had a really charming premise, where this guy has a boss who's outwardly very ikemen-ish, very stylish, very put together, competent at his job, and he seems kind of like aloof and distant, but he realizes pretty quickly, no, he's just like a huge goober. That premise sounds awesome to me. I think I'd have a lot of fun with it. Again, I'll probably just read the manga at some point, but it looks good. Bullbuster is probably the show that I didn't end up watching that I was most interested in. It's by Studio Nut, another Studio Nut original. I've been really impressed with their work in the past, especially on Decadence, which was another original from them. It seemed really interesting insofar as it's like a mecha series, quote unquote, but it makes it as like down to earth and realistic as possible. The mechs are basically big pieces of construction equipment, and they're treated that way by all the people involved. There's no kind of like flashy sense of heroics or destiny or justice or whatever. It's just we've got the typical premise of these weird alien-esque monsters coming to wreak havoc, but it's very down to earth. The monsters at most are going to be capable of like destroying a small shop front or something, and then they deploy these pseudo mechs that are really more just like bulldozers. And they focus a lot on like, oh, you'll get nauseous riding around in this big shifting weight, and oh, you have to sign all these like insurance liability waivers and stuff, and all these like very down to earth logistical questions around like, well, who's funding buying these? Who's responsible? Is it the government? Is it this independent contractor? I really loved it. The first episode I thought was just great, but I didn't get a chance to watch the rest. Okay, and then there are 3 shows that I was watching last season, but they're 2 core, continuing to this year, into this season, so we'll get reviews of them around when this season ends, give or take how busy I am. And that's Frieren, which I'm really enjoying. It's a really lovely, well done series with a lot of pretty interesting ideas, some pretty strange ideas, a few things I really dislike too, so I'm really looking forward to talking about it, but overall very happy with this one. The Apothecary Diaries, which I'm also very happy with. Both of these super critically acclaimed manga, I think, are nailing it on these adaptations, and I've been really enjoying them. Again, I have a lot to say about this kind of characterization, comparing and contrasting it to My Happy Marriage, which is kind of in the same sort of general genre scope, but radically different in a lot of ways. And then Undead Unluck, which I wasn't that excited for when it was announced, but then I realized that the main director for it is actually like an ex-Shaft guy who did a lot of the really classic Shaft series and brings that kind of sensibility of adaptation to Undead Unluck, which is a really insane Weekly Shonen Jump series, it turns out. The premise is just like bizarre, like true postmodern shonen right here, up there with like Chainsaw Man and stuff. Really enjoying this one. I have a lot to praise about it, so look forward to these reviews once I've finished watching the full 2 core. Let's get into what I did watch, starting with 16-Bit Sensation Another Lair. This is a very fun premise, a fun one that I was happy that we picked up in our anime watching club. A modern gacha game artist travels back in time to the advent of Bishoujo gaming via a magical game store selling time slip games. So she opens one of the games she bought in the store. She's warped back to the moment that game was released in the past. And you learn a lot of pretty cool stuff here, like getting into this deep history of Bishoujo games, not just, you know, what they were and when they existed and what the reputation of them and stuff was, but how they were made. These different eras of programming and computer art and stuff, I think, are really well expressed and explored. And you can see, yeah, the cultural evolution around these games through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s. This was really especially fascinating to me because I haven't really delved into this history too much. And to me, Bishoujo games as like a cultural entity within the greater scope of anime and otaku, dumb and everything was really kind of like always there. Like by the time I learned about these things, the culture was already like so established. There was already kind of like classics, you know, like by the time I learned about KyoAni, they had already done the Clannad adaptation. I never was there for just Clannad. I was never there for pre-Clannad, if that makes sense. And the historical relevance is even better because they use real games. And I think this is a quality of the show that really surprised me and I think would have made the show a lot weaker were it not there. Instead of just making kind of genericized titles and obvious homages and parodies and references and stuff, which is also, very fun, and it's fun to like spot the reference. I think using actual real games and talking about their actual real impact and how landmark they were and how they situate within this cultural history is just really fantastic, and you come out like genuinely educated on the subject. What made this so funny is that in the ED credits there is always like one frame, one not one frame, but one title of credits that was just acknowledgments to different game companies and stuff for using their box art and their titles and making reference to the stories and stuff. And it was always just this huge wall of text. Sometimes I think it was even on two like transitions. Very good. I think they could have gone even deeper into this. There is a lot where they do make some reference to, oh, this is the first one to kind of have this sort of feature. Oh, this is the one that kicked off the boom of this sort of character. This is the one that really broke into the mainstream and captured this sort of audience, which I really liked. But I wish they had gone even deeper into like what is actually in those titles. And a lot of other titles they just reference by name, and I've often heard of them too. But they really kind of assume you should know, I think, a lot of the details of each of these. So really, I mean, that's my bad. Like, that's my own lack of education. But I think it would have been fun to, even like in a totally diegetic breaking way, have like maybe a feature of the outro where they just dive into one specific game and talk about what its plot was and why people loved it and stuff. So, eventually, her going back into the past interferes with what happens in the future, which is kind of compelling, I think it's a lot more interesting that they went in that direction rather than this just kind of being like a wish fulfillment show where she warps back to see all these different episodes in the history of Bishoujo games, but there's no like greater overarching plot. But at the same time, I feel like it started creating this like weird cognitive dissonance where at once they wanted to have like a really compelling plot line that was really tense around how will she save the future, what are the devastating consequences of these different actions, but everything was still so hyper focused on Bishoujo games, and this idea that like Bishoujo games are like the most consequential thing in the world. Which, like, obviously they're not expecting you to take that super, super seriously, but it still kind of diminished the tension and it made things sort of feel dumb. And the ending sort of flopped for me. It just starts escalating way too much in way too many ways that I thought were really weird. Although, I do think it was kind of funny. A major element that starts to be involved is like, oh, AI can help you write and character design and do art and all this other stuff for Bishoujo games. And I actually thought they did a pretty good job, like actually offering a balanced take on what sort of opportunities this would offer and how it could be really helpful to artists, but then also the major risk that it could have if people took it too far and started abusing it and tried to use it in lieu of artists, which I think is like kind of realistic insofar as like, obviously right now the real discourse unfolding around AI is a lot more complex than that and in many ways is a lot more like muddied than that with all sorts of aspects of the actual factual use cases of AI and stuff. But I feel like if we had a very idealized understanding of what AI could do as an assistant for these sorts of things, it would lead more to this sort of like discourse and these sorts of crises and stuff. So I thought that was very interesting to explore. Okay, but I have another beef with this series, and it's one that really surprised me because typically this is an aspect of anime that I don't really start feeling mad about a show or disliking a show or anything because of this element, which is the protagonist. There are aspects of her that I liked. I really liked her otaku passion. It felt very well realized insofar as she felt like she had the obsessiveness and lines of thinking and stuff of a real otaku that had spent her whole life playing Bishoujo games. Even though I personally don't really care that much about Bishoujo games, like, it was very interesting to learn about them, but this is not a genre that I have any interest in playing myself, that I have any real personal attachment to. I could see why she was obsessed with them. Like, I could understand what aspects shone for her and really resonated with her and made her so passionate. So that was very well expressed. And at sometimes she was like very relatable in her otaku isms. A famous moment in the series is she wants to feel like pumped up and energized, so she listens to the Madoka OP. And they actually play the Madoka OP because the show is based like that, and they like make it really diegetic, like it really sounds like it's just coming out of her phone speaker. I loved that. There's a lot of little moments like that where I was just like, yeah, this is my girl. But then she's so dumb. Like, sometimes she's just so stupid, so clueless, so unable to make any sort of like logical step or figure out what to say in some situation or like figure out what something means, that it like reduces engagement in the plot. For a while now, whenever we have these sorts of like kind of time loop plot lines or anything sort of similar, the trend is to have an MC that's like hyper competent, right? This, I think, you can date back to like light Yamagami Yamagami in Death Note. But of course, there's examples before that too. But I feel like this very strong trend of like the MC is always instantly deducing every ramification of everything, blah, blah, blah. They're like one step ahead of you. Whenever you figured something out, you're sure to see a scene where the MC is like, well, actually, I deduced X, Y, Z, and I'd been planning for it, and that's like the next level of twist. And that's all fine, but I think it can go too far because it reduces certain types of tension. You know, it is nice sometimes to have a tension where you know what the MC should do, either because you're privy to some knowledge they don't have, or you've just figured out something that they haven't, and you're waiting to see, will they make the connection? Sometimes it feels kind of alienating because, you know, if the MC is always one step ahead of you, then you don't really feel that attached to them as a character. Especially if they're making really outrageous leaps of logic and intuition to solve things that aren't really solvable. I think it really disorients the pacing as well, because instead of kind of like a natural progression of mysteries and solves, it's kind of just like a speed run between something being introduced, the MC deducing it, and then like the long kind of ramification of that. So, I don't know, I've had beef with this kind of writing for a while, too. Like, Summertime Render, if you go back to my review of that, I complained a lot about this kind of, like, thinking and the way it took the plot, which I thought wasn't great. But I think this swings the pendulum too far in the other direction. Like, she can't figure, like, anything out. I can only think of, like, a couple times where she comes to some conclusion on her own and, like, acts on it, instead of just kind of like endlessly warbling around. Most of the time it's her buddy that deduces everything and just like tells her what to do. And I found that very annoying. And then in general, I just found her really grating and annoying. She's constantly doing that, the crying all the time, especially in the last few episodes. She's just crying, like, all the time, screaming all the time. Her tonality is just this screeching, high register, like, if she's happy, she's screeching. If she's upset, she's screeching. And then there's another character, big spoilers, I won't say who, but you'll know who I mean. She appears really just in one episode, but when I watched that episode, I literally got a headache from this character. It's just so high-pitched and grating. And it's like, wow, am I becoming a normie? Like, I've heard people complain before, oh, I don't like anime because the characters are just, like, so grating and loud and screeching and stuff. And that's never bothered me before or now. It's just like, wow, like, am I losing my vaccination on this? Am I losing my ability to enjoy this because I've just fallen away from it too far? Or maybe it's just like actually beyond the pale, like maybe this is an extreme in gratingness. I don't know. Are there other shows that I used to like that if I went back to, I would just feel like wincing? I don't know. It kind of freaks me out. I don't like that bothered me. I it's never bothered me before, but she was just too much, too much. Okay. Overall though, I'll give this a 7.5. I did like it quite a bit. I thought it was quite interesting. I liked all the Bishojo game references and stuff and learning about all of that. I liked the premise in general. I like a good time travel story. I think this executed on a lot of concepts really well. But man, even seeing this image, I can feel her voice like a drill into my frontal lobe. Okay, next. Let's talk about Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2. We're back in Season 2 of Sorcery Fight, which is the official English localized title, which you will never hear anyone use under any circumstances. Since Season 1, this has become a phenomenon among phenomena in Battle Shonen. Like, this has gone from, you know, just another something running in Weekly Shonen Jump to, like, one of the big dogs. And I think it's very interesting because this wasn't born from, like, raw franchisability. That is, like, the ability to make a bunch of merch, the ability to make endless spin-off movies, the ability to tackle a whole bunch of very diverse audiences for diverse reasons. Things that I think, like BNHA and Demon Slayer, not that there's anything wrong with that, not that this is making them, like, lesser of series, your typical kind of, like, flagship Shonen Jump series have really excelled on that metric. Like, historically, Naruto, Bleach, well, Bleach less so, One Piece, Dragon Ball, I think all fit into this kind of franchisable format. Whereas Jujutsu Kaisen, the appeal is in the violence, in the twists, in raw action, in sexy men. This is what made it a phenomenon. I said that JJK, in my first season JJK review, it felt like a very modernized version of a very generic type of shonen. Like, initially JJK did not surprise me at all. I was like, oh, it's one of these. It's just a very modern version of one of these. And by that, I mean, like, Yu Yu Hakusho is the obvious clear version of this. Bleach, I think, to a lesser extent. When I thought of this, I was like, yeah, there's, like, dozens of these series. And then I was trying to, like, come up with them. But I don't really usually read this type of manga. Like, this isn't my favorite type of shonen battle manga by any stretch. So these are the only two I've actually read, and I couldn't think of any others. But you know what I mean, right? Like violent, lots of death, like main characters can die, really cool designs, an emphasis on kind of like mature, stylish, intense designs, and not so much like ones that are easily translatable into a wide variety of merch that are kind of like iconifiable. Emphasis on, you know, not just kind of like a strict hierarchy of power, but still kind of like a matchup based interaction between two established and often quite complicated power systems. These are hallmarks that JJK took all of these and just kind of brought them into the modern era. Since then, Jujutsu Kaisen, it's gotten more interesting, sure. I think, you know, the longer it's gone, the more kind of interesting twists and elements it's been introducing. But I think it also just proves that this genre is really beloved and that the children crave, the Zoomers yearn for some hot guy with insane powers to rip some other dudes to shreds. They've always wanted it. The lust for violence is there. Since season 1, I also got caught up with the manga. I'm still caught up with the manga. I've been reading it week by week since then. So I was pretty excited. Because the Gojo flashback arc, which was the next major arc to be adapted, was, I think, if not my absolute favorite, definitely one of my favorites in the manga. I had very high expectations for how they could adapt that. There was all sorts of really cool scenes that I couldn't wait to see. Then the Shibuya incident arc, I had, like, more mixed feelings about. I feel like kind of the latter stages of Jujutsu Kaisen has been focused on these, like, really big battle arcs where just, like, 80 fights kind of all happen vaguely at once in the same space over the course of, like, one night. usually subtitled the location incident. And from the start, they've been doing arcs like this, but they just kind of keep getting longer and crazier. And I have mixed feelings about that. We'll get into it, but it has like big moments. Like there are some like super hype moments that I was really excited to see get animated. But yeah. How did it actually turn out? This is like battle shonen fight battles. We have to praise the production to the high heavens. I think that has to be first on our list of discussing this. Mappa really could have easily phoned it in here. And I've talked a lot before that we're really in the kind of like a new golden age of battle shonen adaptation, that before they were all phoned in. A studio like Toei would look at it and say, okay, this is guaranteed money. The manga already sells however many million volumes. There's already however many millions of children that are ready and eager to watch this. Let's just kind of do the bare minimum, stuff it full of filler, run it 52 weeks a year, and people will tune in. And that was true. That worked. But starting with Boku no Hero Academia, I would say is kind of the lead example of this, being animated by Studio Bones, Demon Slayer, Jujutsu Kaisen itself. A lot of these series now started getting like a lot more attention and focus, with the logic of why not use the anime to expand the fan base? Why are we just aiming for fans of the manga? There's way more people, especially when you're looking at the Western audiences, that watch anime than read manga. That will spend a lot of merch on anime that they like in a way that people who just read manga typically won't. And I think there was even a transitional period where they would like start strong to attract this audience and then start phoning it in. We saw this with like One Punch Man, or The Promised Neverland, where they just started making really questionable choices past the first season, once they'd already kind of got a larger viewership hooked. And Mappa could have done that. They were in like a prime position to do that because they have other things to do. That studio is hella busy with like 8 parallel projects. They knew the loyal audience was there. They knew the coming arcs had really crazy shit that like could stand on their own, even with pretty minimal route adaptation. All the most popular characters were going to get huge moments to shine and continue pushing merch. The money was already in the bank, no matter what they released. But no, they went way harder than season 1 in so many different directions. The super cinematic vacation bliss, into Toji Zen and drool-worthy choreography, into the Gojo psychedelic explosions that were some of my favorite moments of the whole season. And then, in the second arc, in the massive Shibuya incident arc, 16 consecutive fights. I counted them. 16 consecutive fights with lots of other action in between, where every single fight has its own choreographic style, its own visual language, its own explosive twists. And that's partially the strength of the writing, but emphasizing that so clearly with such creativity and such effort to make every fight feel visually distinct, like just the pacing of it, the way it moves, the ways that like speed and power are conveyed for each of these characters in each of these matchups. It's really impressive. This is insane. It's insane to the extent that we got a ton of mainstream news stories, well, mainstream for anime, reporting on like Studio Mappa slave driving working conditions. And I have like very mixed feelings about this, because it's like, okay, true, absolutely true. We need to give animators in Japan a lot more money, a lot more flexibility, a lot more cushions in terms of their pacing so that they don't work themselves to death. Very few studios have figured this out. Very few studios do it correctly. The vast majority of them are stuck on the mentality that Tezuka came up with in like the 50s. It was like, we could probably animate one a week. That old psychopath. And Mappa, you know, I honestly think is like better than most in terms of what I've heard. The vast majority of anime is made under even worse conditions than this, even tighter deadlines, even more unreasonable demands. So it kind of was like annoying for this to kind of finally become like a mainstream news story that talked about Mappa as if it was like some huge anomaly. And it's like, no, that's just how it is. It's not good that that's how it is. It's good that we bring light to it and try to put pressure to improve these conditions. But like, why are you like holding up Mappa as this like one horrible aberration in the otherwise smiling, happy friendship of Japanese animators? anyways, this is enough about all that. Okay, so here's the thing though, and this sounds absurd, because this is a battle shonen where the meat of the whole series is fights. But is the Shibuya incident arc actually too much fighting? It seems kind of insane to say this too, because so many of the fights are so good. Like, I wouldn't say they're all, S tier, completely creatively new and fresh and amazing. Some of them are. Like, easily the top 5 arcs, or the top 5 fights in this arc are, like, among the best animated battle shonen fights, like, ever. Now, a lot of them are also just good. They're just, like, solidly really good. But it's like, is that too much? It's just fighting. And I think this arc really reaches the sweet spot in terms of Gege Sensei's writing, where you get, like, a lot of the focus on how everybody has different powers. They're all, like, really insanely complicated and stuff. The way they, like, interfere with each other is legitimately pretty cool. And at this point, it's still very comprehensible and trackable. Like, you can still kind of understand it, understand the ramifications of it. Later, it gets, like, really wild. And then also, because they're still kind of straightforward, like, straightforward enough, there's just such raw Kino madness that's just, like, immediately graspable. Such high impact. It really is a sweet spot in terms of that. It's fantastic. But it's like the whole arc, which is like 16 episodes, something like that, is really just like fight. Whoa, shocker, huge twist. Fight. A little flashback. Maybe we learn what somebody's powers are in this flashback, and then fight. Oh, big shocker. Oh, crap. Oh my god, I can't believe that happened. Fight. And it's like, and I don't know, because I already knew all these twists, the shocker, like, I was really excited to see how they'd be animated and stuff. It was fun to watch them in Anime Club and see people's reactions to them. But it started getting, like, pretty exhausting. And I said this stuff with the latest Demon Slayer arc too, and I think it's like, it's tough because it's a lot more enjoyable in manga, I think, these like massive battle-a-thon arcs, because you're reading it like week by week, and it's not like completely consuming your sensory inputs. You're just reading it, and it's only like 16 pages or whatever, whereas here it's just this extremely visually stimulating overload of like fighting for like 22 straight minutes. And then next week is just like another 22 straight minutes. Like, it doesn't sound all that crazy different between manga and anime. It's still weekly. But it's really just kind of the difference between reading a chapter in like 10 minutes and watching an anime in 22 minutes is like doubly, just in terms of time commitment, a double commitment to just fighting. I don't know. And I think in general, like, especially since they know that these adaptations are coming and they're thinking about the expectations of the anime audience, I feel like mangaka kind of got to start getting it through their head, like, more is not always better. You need to balance these things. You need to pace them out. I think this is a something that Oda does very well. The climaxes of a lot of One Piece arcs are just fighting, basically, nonstop for, like, months. But they make the fights very different, not just in terms of like choreography or style, but some of the fights will be like really funny, some of them will be like heartwarming and sad, some of them will be like super epic and climactic, and there's usually like a few non-fight things going on too, like some of the characters carrying out some like espionage mission or some other breakthrough being made, and he like paces these out within chapters too, but then certainly within the anime, they have the ability to like cut between things that alleviate some of this exhaustion, and even up to the very climax of the arc, he's able to like bounce around a little bit and keep it balanced. Anyways, Overall, I was still very, very happy with this, though. Like, I hope my complaints at the end don't feel like they were overpowering my praise, because this was friggin' sweet. This still gets like an 8.5. I think this was a massive upgrade over the first season, and I'm really, really excited to see where they go with this. Alright, next is Spy Family Season 2. This is another mega hit shonen adaptation, escalating along with the fan expectations. Another thing where probably could have phoned it in. They had the viewing base already, but they didn't. Another one where I caught up on the manga during the break. I just can't help myself. With this series especially, I really wanted to know what would happen. I didn't want to wait around for the anime, because it's really far behind. There's like so many very major arcs between the anime and now. I'll say that as hopefully like an enticing pseudo spoiler. I just can't help it, man. I just gotta know. Back in the Season 1 Part 2 review, I talked about Spy Family as an example where you can see the manga really kind of transition and switch gears, moving into the long-running successful series mode from kind of the initial finding your footing, finding your audience, cementing your status mode. That's what I mean by manga transition. I don't mean like trans characters. So I talked about some of the symptoms of this, some of the things that you'll expect to see when the mangaka realizes, oh, hey, my runway for this isn't like month by month or even year by year anymore, but I have like a hit on my hands and I can start writing it for the long term. So you see like a focus on arcs, development of side characters, more kind of lore importance, stuff like the setting, the history, all of that stuff becomes more important. More complex motivations for the characters. They need to have kind of like second order motivations and stuff. They can't have every plot line around every character based around their most immediately stated desire. Bigger and longer emotional swings, not being afraid to stay in one emotional space for longer and really kind of build up that feeling. And all of that became even more true for the series, and trust me, based on reading the manga, it will get even more true. And I think the biggest problem I had, though, in Season 1 Part 2 is fixed with this. Because the arcs that they have, and specifically the cruise ship arc, I think is an absolute masterclass in arc writing. And this is going to tie in with what I was just saying about Oda, where all throughout the arc, even in the big climactic moments, he strives for kind of like an emotional balance that makes it so you're never too mired within one kind of emotional space and one kind of mode. But yeah, moving past that appeal, let's just talk about how the arc is written and why I think it's so great. Premise is set up both through a plot/lore, kind of like big relevant shakeup, but then also elements of it are set up through just very silly coincidence. The stakes are very clear at the start. On all sorts of different levels, you understand how this impacts the greater lore of the series, the sort of revelations you'll have, but also just kind of the ongoing plot at its most grand level could be majorly shaken up by this. You understand how it's going to impact the characters' emotions, how it's going to impact their character development. And then you have a very clear locality of time and place. It's all happening on this one cruise ship cruise, for all of these threads to start interweaving and interfering in a way that highlights each character's personality, plays to their strengths and weaknesses, plus little wacky... Oh, this is an on top of the cruise ship arc. There's lots of wacky standalone adventures, really great production. Honestly, though, I felt like the production was a little weaker in this season than before. Like, I'm not going to say, oh, they phoned it in. It's a million miles from that. And there were some really, really amazing sequences. But, it just didn't hit the feeling of, like, freshness, I guess, that the first season had. Where it was like, wow, holy shit, this is, like, kind of, like, almost the KyoAni style being done by this different studio. I don't know. I don't... It's not like I'm even complaining about the production. The production was really good. Lots and lots of love was put into this. It's very clear to see. I'm still a huge fan of just how much they're pushing this. I'll give this, though, only like a 9 out of 10. And I felt kind of weird doing this because I gave the previous seasons like a 10 and a 9.5. And I don't think it's like necessarily getting worse. I think it's more just that it's like not getting like the cruise ship arc is fantastic, but like overall, it's still just kind of like the same level of quality, I guess I would say. And thus the feeling of like newness and hugeness and innovation from when the adaptation started is now becoming like less impactful. And so this didn't really blow my mind like it used to, even though it still plays to all of the same strengths. So yeah, it's still really good though. Like I encourage you to go back and watch my review, especially of the first season, because I think I really break down why the series is so appealing, and it is great. Okay, moving on to one of two Netflix shows to close out this batch of review. We're looking at Scott Pilgrim Takes Off. This is the latest and IMO greatest in the long, strange history of Skilgrim. Skilgrim. Oh boy. I've been talking for 40 minutes. I deserve a flubber too. Let me get a drink of water. Scott Pilgrim. The man's name is Scott Pilgrim. So, it is a weird history, right? Like, we start with this indie comic from Canada that over its run becomes a total phenom and attracts this huge cult following that then, right at the final release of the final graphic novel, they also launched this pretty big Hollywood movie that has some really big names of the time attached. Became this huge success, both in terms of initial critical response. I think the initial box office was like, but then it really had legs and it's become like an absolute cult classic. The video game also released around then, I think, is kind of understated in how much it really reinforced this like Scott Pilgrim phenomenon. And now, I wrote inexplicably here, but then later I actually discuss why. But now it's like 14 years later, and we get Science Saru of all studios, famous for Ping Pong, Devilman Crybaby, Mind Game, Tatami Galaxy, Walk On Girl, The Night Is Young. I don't know, lots of stuff that you'll probably have heard of if you are big into anime. It's like really weird for a studio that I associate a lot with like prestige and very deliberate choices in terms of adaptation, to be jumping on something like this. Like it is weird. There is no one coherent explanation for this. So I read the first 5 comics in 2009, right before I started university, and then pretty soon after I started university, I read the big finale, and I really liked them. They were chock full of nerdy references back when that actually still kind of felt fresh and not just very lame and cloying and pandering. It had this nice, casual, irreverent humor that... This is meant to say irreverent. It's not supposed to say irrelevant. That's a written flub. Humor that was, not like overly offensive, but was kind of rude and... silly, and I don't know, really great, very comfy slice of life at times. It was packed full of Toronto references, which was a big city that I visited often. They would go to landmarks that I had been to, and that was just so cool for me, especially at the time. And I thought, a nicely well-realized character arc for Scott. I thought it took this character, and through the course of 6 books or whatever, built him up into somebody pretty interesting and compelling. One complaint, this show is much less heavy on explicit Toronto references. A lot of the scenes that took place in famous Toronto landmarks are gone. And then in many cases in real life, those Toronto landmarks are gone too, which is kind of sad. There's no more honest Eds. How do we live in this world without honest Eds? None of their stuff is like genericized, like Sneaky D's, a venue that they play in the comic, which is a real place in Toronto where I've seen a couple bands play. My cousin played there in a band. I go there for Simpsons trivia sometimes. They have good burritos. No more Sneaky D's in this Scott Pilgrim. What a shame. In the end, though, I didn't like love Scott Pilgrim. I really liked him, but I didn't become like a super fan. And I think it was because I was already like really, really into manga. And so this felt like solid, but it wasn't super special to me. It wasn't like mind blowing. I had already read a lot of kind of like down to earth character stories in the real world that mix in a lot of like fantastical, supernatural elements and have fight scenes and stuff. Like, that wasn't a super novel premise to me. So I don't know. Moreover, I resented them a little bit. I had a feeling of envy. The ways in which Scott Pilgrim felt unique, and the ways in which it was a little bit special, felt like it highlighted my life in some negative light, written flub. There was some je ne sais quoi to Scott's life that mine lacked, and that reading these comics put that into very strong relief. Made me a little bitter. In retrospect, it was like very obvious that the difference, that je ne sais quoi, was that Scott was getting laid and that he didn't experience crippling gender dysphoria, whereas I wasn't, and I did. So for a while, I always qualified myself as like, I appreciate Scott Pilgrim. Yeah, it's not bad. But I'm not really a fan. I'm not like you people. And maybe I was like excessive in doing so. Like, I refused to watch the movie for quite a while. And even though, like, you know, the game was being animated by one of my favorite pixel art animators of all time, I was like, looks kind of boring. Like, I don't know. It's just a little excessively a hater. But now that I've like lived through the era of my life where my lifestyle was most similar to Scott, and now I literally live in Toronto itself. I've gone to Sneaky D's a bunch, mostly for Simpsons trivia. I feel like I've made my peace with the franchise. I feel like I have nothing to prove to it, and it has nothing to prove to me, and I no longer have this like bitter envy of Scott Pilgrim. So what do I think of this new adaptation? I think it's basically perfect. I think this is like as good as an adaptation could possibly be. Science Saru nails the style of like mid 2000s Western quote unquote anime that was super popular at the time, like Western artists making their own version of the anime style that's very like chunky, has this very kind of like explosive, gwa, the kawaii kind of personality. Basically something that was born from like only having a very tiny sliver of like Japanese culture and extrapolating that into like something very palpable for Western audiences, something that really appealed to audiences at the time, like wanting to feel like they're into something kind of different, something that would kind of like deliberately, directly contrast kind of like different other styles at the time. You know, the sort of emo style or scene style that was very popular. This was like the kind of kawaii extension and contrast of that. You know what I think the best analogy is that it's like white people Chinese food. The relationship between Western kawaii anime and what actual anime and the contrast between the whole of Chinese cuisine and then white people Chinese that you get like your sweet and sour sauce and stuff. I think that's a good analogy. And I love everything. I love this sort of style. I think it's very nostalgic and very fun and has a lot of like charm and personality. And I love white people Chinese food. I absolutely do. And Science Saru like nails this. Science Saru understands so well the charm and effectiveness of that kind of style. And they bring it to life in a way that exceeds anything that's contemporary to that phase in quality. Like, if you look at the actual output of artists at that time, it's mostly like teenagers making it. This wasn't in a style that was like super adopted in the mainstream in terms of like mainstream productization. The only thing we got were like generally pretty crappy like Cartoon Network shows like Kappa Mikey and stuff that tried to capitalize this. This goes so far beyond that. Throwing in really wildly imaginative psychedelic bursts that really transcend any sort of scene or style when the plot calls for it. It really feels like Flash animators, just kids working away on this stuff, people uprooting this stuff to new grounds, all this stuff in their time, in that time, what they were imagining in their heads, what they were trying to put down on paper. This was it. This is like the fever dream they were having. Plus, I think there's a massive influence of Paul Robertson, who was brought on to do the Scott Pilgrim game and has done a wide range of really, really incredible pixel art animations. I think was a major inspiration on this. I think especially in like the fight scenes and stuff, I see a lot of glimpses of Paul's style, which was really, really awesome. The voice acting also feels very of its time, which is maybe a compliment or maybe not, based on how you take it. Sometimes it's pretty awkward. Sometimes you really get the sense that these actors and actresses who are obviously very gifted and have had major careers in like live action work are not used to doing voice work and maybe have never even done voice work before. And that whoever was directing them, I don't know who it was, if it was someone from Netflix, someone from Science Saru, whatever, didn't really know how to get a voice work performance out of them. And a lot of deliveries are just kind of awkward because it feels like they were betting on their body language and expression in real life to carry it, and then it's very mismatched with the very exaggerated and sometimes kind of like exaggeratedly flat animation. But honestly, this awkwardness like fits. It feels like very amateurish, almostly. Very amateurish at times. That I think really meshes well with that kind of era of like flash animations and stuff. So it's like, I don't know, it's like accidentally almost too perfect. And it's really cool to see that they got like everyone back from the movie. Some pretty big Hollywood names, including people that really blew up in the time since the movie as well. People that by all accounts should have better things to do. Came back and did voice work for this. I think that's awesome. And perhaps most amazing, it has like very big pop song needle drops. I wish I had kind of written some of them down that really stood out to me. I know at one point they do A-Punk by Vampire Weekend in a little montage of friends hanging out and getting up to shenanigans. And it's like so on the nose, and it's so like the obvious choice in some occasions. But I love them. They chose such slappers. All of the EDs, like the credit roll at the end has like needle drops and stuff too, like actual pop songs, and it's like, I don't know, it just hit. Like, I think on paper I'm always gonna find that sort of thing cringy, and I'm always gonna be like, why not just write an original score? I don't need to hear this song for like the 800th time. But on some occasions, they just know what they're doing, and they know how it's going to hit, and then it really nails it. And plus, you know, it's beyond adaptation. This isn't just a retelling of the Scott Pilgrim story. It's very different. I'm sure this isn't a spoiler at this point, because this has been the number one talking point around this show when it came out. The plot deviates very, very significantly from the original story. And I really love this as an adaptation strategy. I wish people did this more. I know it attracted a bunch of controversy and people said really stupid things about it, and maybe it did turn off people that would have loved this otherwise. But I mean, like, sucks to be them. You are able to put in new twists for old fans. They're not just seeing something where they already know what's going to happen, but you get to express the same great charm, all the same things that made it appealing to those fans in the first place. And all of this builds up to, I won't explain it in depth, I don't want to spoil it. I think it's really, really funny. This silly meta story of how the plotline of the original works its way into the plotline of this remake. I was like guffawing. I was literally laughing aloud at some of the plot points, some of the things that happens. I'm often very exhausted by self-referential humor. You know, back, if I really had been seeing this in the mid-2000s, I wouldn't have taken any offense to it. But in the time since then, self-referential humor, meta humor, has been like the go-to for so many forms of comedy, and it like sucks. It just sucks the life out of the joke, and it's like not clever at all anymore because every person on the planet is doing it. And again, like, yeah, if I had heard, oh yeah, it's full of like little meta jokes and stuff, I would have been exhausted. But this style of it, where it's like so goofy, and just the way it's incorporated, and just like the fact that it's just the setup for comedy most of the time, and the jokes are on top of the absurdity of this meta premise, it really, really works for me. Some of the choices at the end got very silly. Like, I have no clue why they chose to do it this way on a lot of points, but it led to really good action sequences, really good catharsis. So I wasn't really even mad at it. I was like, all right, you earned it. But we'll end this review by talking briefly about the "Is Scott a Good Guy" discourse, which before the show even came out, I saw all over the place on Twitter. And I never even realized that this was like the lens by which people were looking at the show and the series as a whole. And a lot of debates around, yeah, everybody loves this movie. Everybody's supposed to love Scott, but he's actually kind of a bad guy. And to me, that just seemed silly because that's what the story is about. It's about Scott coming to realize his shortcomings and growing as a person and stuff, right? Like, am I crazy? The very series is saying the same things that you are, right? So to me, the way that he's supposed to operate is that, like, he is insensitive. He is inconsiderate of people. He hurts people because of that, but he's actually very charming and goofy, and he's just this goober that you want to hang out with, and he's like cool in some ways. And that's the only way it makes sense that he's able to harm people and be inconsiderate of them, because they actually want to be with him in the first place. Like, I think this character is maybe hard to write these days if people are going to be like, I feel like I'm about to complain about like woke culture or something, but it's like these days people can't really ride with a nuanced character for a while, where you can see the charm and it like makes sense that people like them, but you also notice flaws and you have to like wait perhaps years for the payoff of those flaws and for like the growth and stuff. But I think Scott is a good example of that type of character. And I like that kind of message of like, somebody can be likable and really fun to hang out with, but also have big flaws that they need to work on and not just avoid forever. Like, that's true of a lot of people. This good. Yeah. So overall, I would rate this a 9.5 out of 10. I was very, very impressed, especially just with the production. I just love Science Saru as a studio, and this was like another great entry into a very, very diverse catalog of stuff that they're just really good at. In the end, though, I guess it just is like, the plot is just like fine. Like, no, it's quite good, but it's not the most compelling, amazing thing in the world to me. And it remains that way in this new adaptation. Good stuff, though. Check it out. If you love Scott Pilgrim, you've already watched it. But anyone else, read the comics. Doesn't take that long. And then watch this. It's great. All right, finally, we will talk about Pluto. Something even more inexplicable than Scott Pilgrim is this faithful, totally comprehensive, it's around 6 to 7 hours long. I didn't add up the times total. Adaptation of Urasawa's manga that ran way back from 2003 to 2009, which in turn was his interpretation of an Astro Boy arc that Tezuka wrote in the original run of Astro Boy, like way back in the 50s. So, like, why does this exist? Why did they make this now? We'll get into that later, but first let's praise it a lot. This was really, really good. I was so blown away by how good this was. My hopes were pretty high because I had read the manga around when it finished. I picked up all of the volumes from Chapters. I think I had like birthday money or something. It's like, yeah, this looks cool. and I loved it. But at the time, I was a huge Urasawa fan. I was going through like his whole oeuvre. And although I loved Pluto, in my mind it was lesser than 20th Century Boys and Monster. Those were the ones that like really, really stuck with me and really expanded my mind on manga in general. Whereas Pluto, I was just like, oh, this is very good. So I thought, I don't know, like maybe my tastes have changed a lot. I'm not as into Urasawa anymore. I haven't read his latest series, for example. I generally am just not reading that genre of manga as much. Maybe this wouldn't hit the same. I wasn't sure. But oh man, though, it hit. It felt like I was just a kid again. Like, it floored me at times in the same way as it did when I was a kid. Like, it brought me back to those feelings. I remembered the gist of the plot for sure. I remembered all the characters and how it kind of went. But, like, specific scenes, like, very specific images, like, just panels, boom, when I saw them again, it just, like, rushed back into me. Stuff that I hadn't seen or thought about in, like, a decade suddenly felt like, oh, no, that had always been in there. That image had always been in my mind on some level. And then they were always on my mind again. The show came out way back in October, and I've been very slowly watching it, an episode here and there, ever since. I only finished it like 2 days ago. But it was always lingering in the gaps. The ideas, the images, the sadness. After some of these episodes, man, I would just be like going about my day and being like, can't believe he's dead. So, let's talk a little bit about the production. Because the production is superb. I think it enhances every element that I loved from the manga, brings it into this new medium in a completely expert way. I usually praise anime production when it takes advantage of the unique qualities of anime. And by that I mean stuff like breaking out of the diegesis, going into like the diagram space, not just depicting events as they are, but free trespass into the character's imagination, morphing every element of the art style in response to the emotional mood of the scene or the joke or the whatever, incorporating a ton of quote-unquote mixed media, that is, switching to all sorts of different art styles, busting out different drawing methods and techniques and materials. Basically, Bocchi the Rock is like the ideal. You can go back and watch my Bocchi the Rock review if you want to hear just endless praise of the creativity of that adaptation. And often I criticize anime or aspects of anime that I feel could have just been live action. Even if it's like very technically strong, even if it's like good choreography or like good cinematography or whatever, if it just feels like, well, you could have just shot this with a camera, it's less interesting to me. It's not that I think that it's bad, it's just not what I'm looking for. So I feel a little hypocritical to praise Pluto in its adaptation so much when it is, on most occasions, basically just live action. But I think what it nails, and what makes this feel so different, is that it's not just generic live action or anything like that, but it nails a style that I really associate with anime. It's a very much a revival of the mid-2000s, 90s, to an extent even earlier than this. You can argue all day about when this kind of style emerged. I would call it like the OVA style. Of course, there was also TV anime that looked like this. But in my mind, I associate this kind of look with like a lot of the really kind of classic sci-fi thriller OVAs of that era. And we very, very rarely see stuff animated in this style. For one, because it's really hard. But it's just not that popular anymore. The really detail-heavy, with lots of kind of accentation lines, balanced by bathing everything in super harsh shadowing and super strong contrasts that make it both like a very intricate and visually interesting image that's at once super readable in terms of kind of like where lines of conflict or mystery, the unknown and known, like really visually expressive in that way. It's very effortlessly cinematic in that, I put effortlessly in quotes because this actually takes a shit ton of effort. But every shot has a very high floor on how it's like framed and blocked, how the characters move, how the shot is introduced, stuff like that, as if it was being shot IRL by a very talented filmmaker. But typically in anime, things are simplified even sooner for kind of like resource reuse and just making things easier on the key animators and stuff. That sort of consideration is taken, whereas I would say this style is much more like, imagine we were shooting a movie. What is the most visually interesting and cinematographic that's not even a word. Cinematographically, what has the most interesting cinematography is like the consideration for how these shots are built. It's a major focus on character acting, you know, the very nuances of motion that come across on the face, in the body language. Nothing very exaggerated, nothing unrealistic. Some focus on the mechanical details of the world. This is something that, when you see this sort of era of OVA, the most common place you'll see it is in like a clip of some really awesome scene of like a machine working or like a spaceship launching. There was this like obsessive focus on those mechanical details in this era that Pluto does to some extent, but I wish it did even more. There's a lot of opportunities it could have taken, and I think it's just because it wasn't in the manga, they didn't really dive into this. There are some really nice scenes like this, though. Wildly expressive experimental sequences, but only when earned, you know, not just for anything, not just to kind of convey a character's thought or mood under normal circumstances, but only in really climactic scenes where it feels like the bounds of how things are normally conveyed are just getting ripped open. These really hit. These, I think, are really, really well done. And I think, again, line up not only to how they were done in, like, OVAs, where maybe this sort of thing would happen in, like, a big climactic sequence, but also, again, just kind of, like, the most critically acclaimed, boundary-pushing genre film of that era. Like, if you look, probably the most famous example is 2001, that has, like, a huge psychedelic sequence at the end, or the works of like John Carpenter and stuff that would kind of push into this territory when hitting these kind of like extremes of tension and climax. Though, oh man, just thinking about the sequences in Pluto that are like this is good. It's so good. This style is revived in concert with what I can only really describe, and we'll get into this more later, as like the prestige TV version of anime. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Let's first talk about why these shows exist. We've gushed a lot over 2 Netflix original anime back to back. It's like, what's up with them? Why did they make these? One is a pseudo adaptation / revival of a Western indie big comic hit that ran from 2004 to 2010. That pushes it deep into the cutting edge of anime, flashy, experimental, stylized, and flips the script on long-term fans with all sorts of twists that pull it away from the original source material. On the other hand, we have Pluto, which is an adaptation of a critically acclaimed manga that ran from 2003 to 2009. It was very famous in Japan. It got localized here, but I don't know, I just don't see people talk about it too much. It's like a manga for manga fans. It never really kind of broke into a wider mainstream audience in the West. I think largely because it didn't have an adaptation, whereas something like Monster did, and, is discussed all the more for it. It presents the Pluto manga cinematically and very faithfully in the style of anime that is kind of parallel to the manga at the time. And it sticks to the script a ton, like more than any other anime adaptation I've seen. I think it's almost like 1-to-1, volume by volume, panel by panel, just taking the entire manga and animating it. For Scott, I think Netflix was like, oh, there's money on the table. The cult following of the comics and movie is still really going strong. You'll still see people posting like gifs from the movie on Twitter and stuff. Like, the following is there, the fandom is there. For Pluto, I think this is a strategy that Netflix wants to bridge the audiences of anime watchers, or like a specific subset of anime watcher, and prestige TV watchers. And by prestige TV, I'm talking about the very wide genre that encompasses a lot of other genres, like a type of television show that can be debated to start with like The Sopranos on HBO. And there's a lot of like the HBO big flagpole series, The Wire, Oz, Breaking Bad, Mad Men. These aren't all HBO, but you know what I mean. This kind of movement of television ascending to an art form that is somewhere between TV as we knew it and like film. You can read all sorts of articles breaking down, exactly what is prestige TV, what is the phenomenon of prestige TV. Lately, you're seeing articles about, is it the end of prestige TV? Is this movement kind of running out of steam? Mostly because they've realized that the viewership of them is lesser than the viewership of shows where you can look at your phone the whole time. And prestige TV, you could almost say, is defined by being TV where you can't be looking at your phone the whole time. At any rate, prestige TV, at least at this moment, is still a very large, lucrative audience. And I think basically when they were adapting this, the reason they sought it out, the reason they decided this was worth adapting, 10 plus years, almost 15 years after it finished airing, over 20 years since it started running, they decided now is the time for a Pluto adaptation. I think because it fits so well within like the expectations of prestige TV, they could easily go volume by volume and make episodes that are like 40 to 60 minutes. Almost every volume within it and at the end of it has like this growing mystery, big cliffhangers. It's very heavily performance driven. The meat of it is just watching the characters express themselves and emote. The themes are like big adult things around war and cycles of violence and hatred, what it means to be human, civil rights issues for the minority group of robots, the interference between technology and tradition, all these things that really make it appealing to this kind of like hypothetical prestige TV audience. And I think they're trying to bridge it bi-directionally, because as I said, like the prestige TV audience probably hasn't really considered watching anime very much, even though there's a lot of anime that I'm sure a fan of Breaking Bad or The Wire or Sopranos or something would really, really love. These are shows that just haven't been at the top of the mainstream, and for some reason, oh my god, this could be a huge rant, but you see anime fans trying to get people into anime, and it's like, bro, they don't like anime yet. There's a reason for that. Why the fuck are you telling them to watch Attack on Titan? Like, you have to meet them where they are and find out the genres they like in Western TV and movies, and then find anime that has a similar appeal. Don't just tell them to watch the most popular anime, even if you think it's good. Even if it is good, that's not the sort of shit they like to watch. Oh my god, it aggravates me so much. But yeah, I basically think there's a huge audience of people that like watching serious television and paying attention to it and getting invested in it, that would love a whole lot of anime that's out there. They just need something that bridges the gap, and I think this is an effort to really bridge the gap and like open those doors to them. And on the other hand, Netflix has a big library of prestige TV. It wants anime fans that watch this sort of show, OVA type anime fans, to put it in the most general sense, but like boomers that love Cowboy Bebop, to realize, and this is maybe true for a lot of Japanese audiences too, that there's a bunch of really high quality Western TV that they would love. Watch Breaking Bad. It's great. Watch The Wire. It's great. So this is like a very sensible and I think actually like quite admirable goal to bridge these audiences and to make them appreciate one another. But I think trying to make Pluto like a prestige TV show, some stuff doesn't quite work. Like this adherence to one volume per episode, I think is very, very less than ideal. Just because a monthly manga series consumed either month by month or within one volume feels very, very different than like an hour of TV that you just sit down and watch as a whole. Just in terms of like emotional balance and positioning cliffhangers and, having one coherent theme throughout the episode that kind of gets explored. I think they should have been a little more flexible on this. I think they should have aimed for shorter episodes that could be a lot more like thematically cohesive and have smarter endpoints. Like I think it's great that they had this like variable episode length thing, but they could have taken it even further and had, a 15-minute episode that just breaks down one particular plot point. That's awesome. Why not? The other thing too is like this was a series written over 6 years. And I don't think it's any knock to Urasawa to say he did not have absolutely everything planned out right from the start. He definitely had the bones and store of the structure, all the way back from Urasawa's Astro Boy original arc. Not Urasawa's, Tezuka's original arc. But obviously a lot of stuff he was going to explore more and flesh out more and decide as the series went along, as he actually drew it and got the reception and talked to his editors. And that's how manga works. That's the beauty of manga. But then trying to condense this whole series that ran over 6 years into like 6 hours of television that most people might watch over like a month or two, it's very, very different. And I feel like you have an expectation of cohesiveness when you watch like one season of television that's like 8 or 9 hour-long episodes that you can't expect from manga. And so I feel like there's going to be a lot of people that watch this and go like, what, like that came out of nowhere, or what happened to that, or why wasn't that foreshadowed? And I think that's just reasonable expectations that have been set up incorrectly through the presentation. So I don't know. It's like food for thought. Netflix executives, if you're watching this, there's like a better way to do this. And I think it's more episodes released in multiple batches. And also the fucking stop batch releases in general. Like, can you at least do like batches of 4 and 4 or something? All 8 at once, I think, is just wholly indefensible. I'm sure they have marketing information that shows it leads to better audience retention or something. There's some wholly financial reason that they do it. But artistically, in terms of giving the viewers the best experience, there is no defense whatsoever for batch releases. They piss me off so much. And it's like, it's such a shame because the show is fantastic. And I think in both cases, both Scott Pilgrim and Pluto, Netflix had an amazing idea. They executed it as good as anyone could ask them for. It's amazing and wonderful that they brought them into this world, but they neutered it so hard. They shot it in the kneecap by making it batch release. They still haven't figured out that if you release things weekly and give time for a community to grow around it and discussion to emerge and anticipation and hype for subsequent episodes, it attracts like a completely different quality of fan base. It builds up the space for like a legacy to form around the show that just never happens when it's a batch release. With it's a batch release, all discussion of it ceases after like a week. And I'm not talking about overall viewing numbers. The overall viewing numbers is probably higher for batch release. That's probably true. But it's the type of fan you get. It's the type of investment you get from the viewers when you do a weekly release that allows these shows to build up the fan bases they had in the first place. Do you think Pluto would have survived as a cultural artifact for like 20 years if it was released all at once on one day? Would people have been talking about it the way they did? No, of course not. Same with Scott Pilgrim. Those books came out year after year. There was anticipation around it. There was hype. There was fans that would discuss what might happen in the future. They didn't just already know. And it's just like they're ruining these shows' chances to really build a long-running fan base. The sort of fan base that then generates the desire for these sorts of projects in the first place. Like, oh my god, it just pisses me off. I just hate batch releases so much. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what Pluto actually is, though. So that's all well and good. What about the actual story of Pluto itself? I want to talk about it a little bit, this, because it's pretty neat. Urasawa's original intent seems to be like, what if we took this Tezuka arc and turned it into like a Bong Joon-ho-esque despairing detective mystery story? And I think it really succeeds on this front. And it does a great job not just kind of introducing the story like this, but returning to this mode in very compelling ways several times throughout the series. There's always mysteries within mysteries. Sometimes the deepest lore ramifications you're learning about, some mysterious new fact. Other times it's like the personal life stories of characters, really diving intimately into those details. But then the story also has to exist in the setting of robots that are as intelligent as humans. That's the conceit. That's what Tezuka was writing. And from the infinite wellspring of Tezuka's imagination in the 50s, we had this really fantabulous vision of the future. I would describe this as like a setting of greatness, where the focus is all on the battles of these most advanced robots, these pinnacles of scientific creations, and then their genius creators themselves. I love how all of them kind of have their specialties and how they were designed. They all represent the greatest technological advances of different countries. This gets reflected in their personalities and the roles that they play in the stories and the personalities of their creators. And then all the other cultural slices of robots in society, I think are sometimes like really bizarre. Like there's stuff about the world building that just like straight up doesn't make sense, to be honest. But like when you think about it, if this actually happened in real life, taking a look at how every other technological advance we've had is manifested, it would be really weird too. If we had this technology of human-level robots, I'm sure it would be just as bizarre and just as nonsensical. And then, looking at the mature themes of the original, the subplots and contexts and world-building of the original Tezuka arc, that weren't just for kids, that weren't just kind of silly and over the top, but instead really touched on some kind of deep and dark things. The way that Pluto focuses in on those and enhances them and really brings them to the forefront. And it's interesting, when Urasawa was first interviewed about this project way back at the start of Pluto, he said that when he read Astro Boy as a kid, and specifically this arc, that he could tell there was like really for adult things that Tezuka had kind of layered underneath. These themes of war, of cycles of hatred, of what it means to be human. And then as a kid, like, one thing I completely missed is the very, in retrospect, obvious, and actually I think very based, the perspective it has on the real-life Gulf War. I don't know, like, I could go on for a lot about this, but I'm getting tired. And I already got so worked up about batch releases. I would say the series is, like, not hard sci-fi. A lot of stuff is, like, pretty fantastical. A lot of stuff, like, doesn't really make sense. There's even some vaguely supernatural elements. But it's, like, hard ideas. The things it makes you confront about geopolitics and the limits of humanity and the limits of artificiality and what it means to be human, what emotions do for you. is it ever good to feel hatred? Is it ever good to feel anger? It's sad, it's moving, and it's just the perfect amount of strange. Yeah. Overall, I really like this one. This is one of those images I mentioned before that as soon as I saw it again, I was just taken back to being a teenager and my mind being like the shock to the system I got when I saw these things the first time. The only thing stopping me from giving it a 10 is that I do feel like the plot is good and solid, but it just doesn't quite execute on all the fronts that I want it to. Especially near the end, it's a lot of like, okay. And it's, you know, it's not a damning flaw, obviously, but it's not quite a 10 for me. Okay, that's all. We talked about a lot of shows. We got a lot of shows coming up next season 2. I gotta get caught up on some stuff. I want to be able to release my winter reviews a little more timely than my fall reviews. But hey, my goal was to get all of my videos about 2023 done within January, and I think we're on track for that. So I'm quite happy. Okay, that's all. Bye-bye.